A tooth the size of a human hand was sitting in a museum drawer for decades. Scientists walked past it every single day. They thought they already understood what kind of animal that tooth came from. They had diagrams of it on walls. They had models of it in glass cases. They had entire documentaries built around it. And then when the right technology finally arrived and those scientists actually tested their long-held assumptions against real chemical evidence, almost everything they believed turned out to be wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong in minor details. Wrong in the most fundamental ways possible, ways that forced researchers to completely rebuild their understanding of one of the most studied creatures in paleontology from the ground up. This is not a story about a monster from a movie. This is the story of what real science actually discovered when it finally had the tools to look. And what it found inside those fossilized teeth changed the entire picture of what Megalodon was, how it lived, why it grew so impossibly large, and why something that dominated every ocean on the planet for 20 million years simply stopped existing one day. The answers were hiding in chemistry, and when those answers finally came out, the scientists involved did not quietly update a textbook. They described their own findings as genuinely unexpected. That word, coming from researchers who had spent entire careers studying this animal, tells you everything about how different the real Megalodon was from the one the world thought it knew. Let us start with what science thought it understood, because that foundation matters. In the year 1843, a Swiss naturalist named Louis Agassiz looked at Megalodon teeth and looked at great white shark teeth and saw the same basic design. Large, serrated, built for tearing through large prey. He placed Megalodon in the same genus as the great white shark, and that single classification decision planted an image into science and popular culture that survived for 180 years. The image of Megalodon as a giant great white shark, bigger in every direction, same shape, same proportions, just scaled up to an enormous and terrifying degree. That image went into museums, it went into textbooks, it went into documentary films, it went into Hollywood blockbusters watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. The problem is that it was not true. And science only discovered just how untrue it was when molecular biology gave researchers the ability to reconstruct family trees using the DNA of living animals. When scientists applied those modern genetic tools to the question of where Megalodon actually sat on the shark family tree, the answer that came back was definitive, and it completely dismantled the Agassiz classification. The great white shark, it turns out, descends from a Mako lineage. Its ancestor is an extinct broad-toothed species called Isurus hastalis. Megalodon descends from an entirely separate evolutionary line, tracing back through a species called Otodus obliquus to a time more than 55 million years ago. These two animals, Megalodon and the great white shark, shared a last common ancestor approximately 100 million years before Megalodon went extinct. 100 million years. That is not a close relationship. That is not a family resemblance. These were competitors from entirely different evolutionary histories who happened to occupy the same ocean at the same time. Megalodon was formally reclassified as Otodus megalodon, placed in its own extinct family called Otodontidae, and the concept of it as a supersized great white was officially retired by the science that finally had the tools to test it. But that was only the beginning of how different the real animal turned out to be, because once researchers knew they were looking at the wrong family tree, they looked harder at everything else. And what happened next, in a laboratory where scientists were analyzing the chemical composition of fossilized teeth, produced a number that nobody was prepared for. A number that changed the entire scientific story of what Megalodon was and why it became the most dominant predator the ocean has ever produced. The technique used was called clumped isotope thermometry. When a tooth mineralizes inside a living animal, heavier isotopes, specifically carbon-13 and oxygen-18, bond together inside the enamel at a rate that is directly controlled by temperature. The warmer the environment where that mineralization happens, the more those heavy isotopes bond together in a specific pattern. That pattern, locked inside the crystal structure of fossil tooth enamel for millions of years, is a direct chemical record of how warm the animal was running when that tooth formed. Scientists had already tested this technique against sharks with documented body temperatures and proven that it works accurately. So when a research team led by Professor Sora Kim of UC Merced, alongside Professor Michael Griffiths and Professor Martin Becker of William Patterson University, Professor Kenshu Shimada of DePaul University, and Professor Rob Eagle of UCLA applied this method to Megalodon teeth and published their results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. In 2023, they were confident in the technique. What they were not confident about was what the technique was going to tell them. Megalodon maintained a body temperature approximately 7 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding seawater. Its overall average body temperature was approximately 27 degrees Celsius. The other sharks fossilized in the same rock layers from the same time period, the ancestors of mako and great white lineages, were running body temperatures between 22 and 26 degrees. Those modern-type sharks are already considered partially warm-blooded compared to the cold-blooded majority of shark species. Megalodon was running warmer than all of them. In an ocean full of cold-blooded animals, this creature was generating and sustaining its own internal heat, consistently, continuously, at a level that no other shark in its ecosystem was reaching. That was the first empirical, chemically measured, experimentally tested evidence of warm-bloodedness in Megalodon. Not inference, not assumption. Real numbers from real teeth. And those numbers rewrote everything. Here is why that single temperature reading matters so profoundly. Warm-bloodedness, which scientists call endothermy, is not just a biological quirk. It is a complete operational system that changes what an animal can do, where it can go, how fast it can respond, and how large it can grow. An endothermic predator has faster muscle response than a cold-blooded animal of similar size. Its muscles work better, recover faster, and deliver more power in cold water, where cold-blooded muscles slow down and become sluggish. An endothermic predator can operate in water temperatures that literally stop ectothermic hunters from functioning effectively. It can dive deeper. It can range into higher latitudes where the water is colder. It can pursue prey across temperature gradients that a cold-blooded hunter simply cannot follow. Every ecological advantage that Megalodon held, every aspect of its unmatched global dominance, suddenly had a single biological explanation: the body heat. The global fossil distribution of Megalodon spans every major ocean basin on the planet. Researchers have found its teeth in warm tropical waters and in cold, high-latitude regions that other sharks of the same period could not sustain themselves in. That distribution made no sense if Megalodon was cold-blooded, because cold-blooded animals are constrained by water, temperature, in fundamental ways. It makes complete sense if Megalodon was warm-blooded. The warm body heat was the key that unlocked the entire ocean. Every ecosystem, every depth, every latitude became accessible to an animal that generated its own warmth regardless of what the surrounding water was doing. And then there's the connection between endothermy and gigantism that researchers describe as mechanistically enforced. In a warm-blooded animal, larger body size improves heat retention. As body volume increases relative to surface area, less heat escapes per unit of mass. A bigger body is a more heat-efficient body in an endothermic animal. This means that every calorie Megalodon consumed to build more body mass simultaneously made its thermoregulation cheaper to run. The size and the warm-bloodedness were not two separate features that happened to appear together. They were locked in a reinforcing cycle where each one made the other more effective. Getting bigger made staying warm easier. Staying warm supported the higher metabolism that enabled continued growth. The extraordinary size of Megalodon was not an accident of evolution. It was the predictable outcome of a biological system in which warmth and mass fed each other across millions of years. But there was a second major discovery hiding inside fossilized Megalodon teeth at the same time, published 1 year earlier in 2022 in the journal Nature Communications. And this one did not use temperature chemistry. It used zinc. When an animal eats, zinc from its food is absorbed into the enamel of its forming teeth. The zinc isotope signature that gets locked into tooth enamel reflects where in the food chain that animal was feeding. Animals higher up the food chain, eating other predators rather than just eating plant-eating prey, carry a distinctive zinc isotope value that differs measurably from animals feeding lower down. An international team led by researcher Jeremy McCormick from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, working alongside many of the same scientists involved in the temperature study, built a database of zinc isotope values from the teeth of 20 living shark species and 13 extinct shark species, including Megalodon itself. The results confirmed that Megalodon was feeding at trophic levels above the contemporary great white shark. It was eating large marine mammals and other significant predators, occupying a position in the food chain that very few animals of the period could access. This was the expected finding. What nobody expected was what the zinc data showed when researchers looked specifically at the time window just before Megalodon went extinct, the period scientists call the early Pliocene, approximately 3 to 5 million years ago. In fossil samples from that precise window, the zinc isotope signatures of early great white sharks and Megalodon had converged. Two apex predators that had previously occupied clearly different positions in the food chain were now showing the same trophic level signature. They were competing for the same prey. The animal that had held the unreachable top of the ocean food chain for 20 million years had been joined there by a smaller, cold-blooded competitor. And when you combine that finding with what the temperature study revealed about Megalodon's biology, the collision between these two species becomes one of the most consequential and tragic stories in the entire history of ocean life. Because warm-bloodedness costs something enormous. Generating and maintaining internal body heat requires continuous, massive caloric intake regardless of external conditions. A cold-blooded animal can slow its metabolism when food becomes scarce. Its body temperature drops to match the environment, its energy demands fall, and it can survive extended periods of limited food by simply doing less. A warm-blooded animal cannot do this. The heat must be maintained. The metabolic demand is always running. A Megalodon, already requiring vast quantities of food simply because of its enormous body mass, was running a warm-blooded metabolism on top of that body mass requirement. The total caloric demand was staggering. It had no margin for disruption. Now consider what was happening to the ocean during the Pliocene. Deep water circulation patterns were restructuring as tectonic shifts changed the geography of ocean basins. Water temperatures were changing. Marine mammal populations, the large prey that had sustained Megalodon's food requirements for millions of years, were contracting and redistributing. The prey was becoming harder to find and less abundant in the places Megalodon had historically hunted. And at exactly this moment, a cold-blooded competitor with a much lower metabolic demand was sharing those same prey resources. The great white shark could endure scarcity in a way Megalodon biologically could not. When prey became limited, the great white could slow down and wait. Megalodon could not wait. It had a body running continuously at full metabolic cost. It needed to keep eating regardless of whether the ocean was still providing the food supply its biology demanded. The biology that had built 20 million years of global dominance had, in a changed ocean, become the mechanism of its own destruction. The very features that made Megalodon the most formidable predator in the history of ocean life, the warm blood, the enormous mass, the metabolic power to hunt anywhere in any conditions, became fatal liabilities the moment the conditions that sustained them began to shift. This is one of the most important insights about extinction that paleontology has produced in recent decades. Megalodon did not disappear because something stronger came along and defeated it. Nothing was stronger than Megalodon. It disappeared because the biological cost of being what it was exceeded what the changing ocean could support. And then came 2025, and the third major revision in as many years. A research team led by Professor Kenshu Shimada, and including 28 co-authors from institutions across multiple continents, published the most comprehensive reconstruction of Megalodon's body size and physical shape ever attempted. This paper, published in the journal Paleontologia Electronica, used vertebral column specimens from Belgium and Denmark, alongside comparative data from 165 living and extinct shark species. The maximum body length estimate the team arrived at was 24.3 meters, approximately 80 feet. Previous estimates had generally placed the upper end of Megalodon's size at somewhere between 15 and 20 meters. This new analysis pushed that ceiling significantly higher. But the body shape finding is what forced the most widespread revision of the visual image that has defined Megalodon in public understanding for nearly 2 centuries. Hydrodynamic modeling showed clearly that the stocky, blunt-nosed, broad body shape that appears in virtually every museum model, every documentary, and every popular depiction of Megalodon would have generated enormous drag resistance at a scale of 24 meters. Moving that stocky body efficiently through water at that size would have required energy expenditure that no animal could sustain. The body form that is actually consistent with moving a 24-meter animal efficiently through water is long, tapered, and streamlined. Professor Philip Stearns, a shark biologist at UC Riverside and co-author of the 2025 study, described it as resembling an enormous lemon shark in its overall proportions, not a massive great white, something fundamentally different in almost every physical dimension from the animal that has represented Megalodon in popular science since 1843. Think about what that means for every depiction of Megalodon you have ever seen. Every museum reconstruction, every movie poster, every documentary illustration, every digital recreation. The shape shown in all of those is incorrect. The real Megalodon was elongated and streamlined, built for efficient, sustained movement through open water, looking more like the largest whale in shape than like the shark it is commonly shown as. The visual record of this animal in human culture is essentially a record of a different animal entirely. And then there was the birth size data embedded in the vertebral growth band analysis from that same 2025 study. Vertebral growth bands in sharks, similar in principle to growth rings in trees, record the history of the animal's development. When researchers read those bands in Megalodon vertebrae and traced growth back to the beginning, they found evidence that Megalodon was born at a length of between 3.6 and 3.9 meters. The behavior that almost certainly produced offspring of that size is called intrauterine oophagy, a process documented in several living shark species in which embryos consume unfertilized eggs inside the womb before birth, fueling growth to extraordinary sizes before the animal ever enters open water. Adult great white sharks reach approximately 3.5 to 5 meters at their maximum size over a full lifetime. A newborn Megalodon entered the ocean at the approximate size of a fully grown adult great white shark. Let that number sit for a moment. The species, whose rise during the early Pliocene is now considered one of the significant contributing factors to Megalodon's extinction, was, at its maximum adult dimensions, comparable in size to what Megalodon produced at birth. These two animals were not competing as equals. They were not even close to equals in any physical dimension. The food chain overlap that zinc isotope data revealed in the early Pliocene was not a story of the great white defeating the Megalodon. It was a story of the Megalodon's biology failing to cope with a changing world, while a smaller, more metabolically flexible animal inherited the resources that were left behind. What all of this research produces, when you lay it together as a complete picture, is an animal that bears almost no resemblance to what was shown in museums and textbooks for the better part of 2 centuries. Megalodon was not a giant great white shark. It was a member of a completely separate family with an evolutionary history that diverged from the great white's ancestors over 100 million years ago. Its body was not stocky and broad, but long and streamlined, proportioned more like a large open ocean whale than like any shark commonly shown in its depictions. It was endothermic, generating and sustaining its own internal body heat at a temperature warmer than every other shark sharing its ecosystem. Its size was not simply a matter of growing large, but the product of a self-reinforcing biological system in which warmth and mass continuously enabled each other across millions of years of evolutionary history. Its newborn offspring entered the ocean already as large as the maximum size of the species that would outlive it. The DNA that would have told all of this story directly is gone. Ancient genetic material survives only up to approximately 1 to 2 million years under the most favorable preservation conditions. Megalodon went extinct at least 3.6 million years ago. That gap cannot be crossed by any existing technology, and no foreseeable development in ancient DNA recovery is going to change that. The genetic record of this animal, whatever information it carried at the molecular level about its biology, its thermoregulation, its growth, its adaptation, is gone in that form and will not come back. But the chemical record locked inside fossilized teeth proved to be something different. Zinc isotopes preserved in enameloid for tens of millions of years, clumped isotope temperature signatures maintained in crystal structures across geological time, growth records encoded in vertebral bands that survived fossilization intact. These are not approximate hints. They are precise measurements of biological realities, the same biological realities that were present in the living animal, preserved by the chemistry of mineralization in a form that the right analytical tools can read accurately. The question was never whether the evidence existed. The question was whether science had the tools to read it. And the answer that the last decade of research has delivered is that the tools, when they finally arrived, told a story more extraordinary than anything the assumptions had imagined. The Megalodon that emerges from this story is not the monster of popular imagination, not the scaled-up nightmare version of a familiar predator. It is something more remarkable than that. It is an animal that solved the problem of oceanic dominance in a way that no other shark in the 400 million year history of sharks had ever solved it, by running warm in a cold sea, by growing to a size that made everything else prey, by building a body whose very mass became part of the thermal efficiency system that kept it operating across every latitude and every depth. It held that solution at the top of the ocean for 20 million years. And when the ocean itself changed, when the prey moved and the competition arrived, and the conditions that had sustained the solution began to erode, the biology that had built the greatest predator in ocean history became the reason that predator could no longer survive. Consider also what the 2025 diet study, published in May of that year by Goethe University Frankfurt, added on top of all of this. Researchers took a much larger sample of Megalodon teeth than any previous zinc isotope study and found something that initially appears to contradict the apex predator image. Megalodon was not exclusively feeding at the very top of the food chain at all times and in all places. Its zinc isotope values showed variation across different fossil sites and different time periods, suggesting that Megalodon was actually a flexible feeder, capable of consuming prey at various levels of the food pyramid, depending on what was available. This is not a downgrade of the animal's status. It is actually a more sophisticated and more ecologically interesting picture. An animal the size of Megalodon, running the metabolic cost of warm-bloodedness, needed an enormous and continuous supply of calories. Rigid exclusive feeding at only the highest trophic level would have been a liability if that prey became temporarily scarce. Dietary flexibility was a survival advantage. The ability to shift prey categories when necessary was part of what sustained a caloric demand of that magnitude across millions of years and across every ocean on the planet. The animal was not just a brute with teeth. It was a sophisticated ecological operator, making feeding decisions that balanced metabolic demands against available resources. And yet, even that flexibility had its limits. when ocean conditions in the Pliocene shifted enough that large marine mammal populations simultaneously declined across multiple ocean basins. No amount of dietary flexibility could bridge the gap between what Megalodon needed to keep its warm body running and what a changed ocean was willing to provide. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves to be stated directly, because it matters for how we understand the extinction. Megalodon's disappearance from the fossil record is not gradual. The teeth do not slowly become less frequent across millions of years of rock layers in a pattern that suggests slow decline. The disappearance is relatively abrupt in geological terms. This is consistent with what the thermal physiology data predicts. An endothermic animal of that size, running that metabolic overhead continuously, does not have the capacity to slowly wind down. When food availability drops below the threshold its biology requires, the outcome is not slow decline, it is collapse. The biological system that ran the entire animal depended on continuous high-calorie input. Remove that input substantially, and the system fails, not gradually, but at the point where the minimum caloric requirement can no longer be met. The pattern in the fossil record matches the biology. The biology explains the pattern. These independent lines of evidence, the chemistry of isotopes and the distribution of fossils through geological time, are telling the same story from different angles. The teeth are still coming out of the ground. Researchers are still analyzing them. The methods being applied to those teeth are still advancing. Every new study of the last several years has revised something that previous studies assumed was settled. The shape was wrong. The size ceiling was wrong. The family relationship was wrong. The thermal physiology was assumed and is now proven. The extinction mechanism was speculative and is now supported by chemistry from multiple independent methods producing consistent results. Science spent nearly 2 centuries building a picture of Megalodon from imagination and incomplete tools. It has spent the last decade systematically taking that picture apart and replacing it with something built entirely from evidence. The animal that emerges from that evidence is not what anyone expected. And the fact that the real story, told in teeth and isotopes and vertebral bands, is this much stranger and this much more remarkable than the invented one, is perhaps the most important thing paleontology has shown us about this creature. The truth of what Megalodon was did not need any exaggeration at all. It just needed the right tools to be read.